Hey, my name is Cynthia. I'm a sophomore at UNC. I'm double majoring in journalism and French, and I'm minoring in English creative writing. So both my parents are from China, and I'll be talking about China today. And I also went to third grade in Hefei, China, which is where my family's from.
So we will move on to China with Cynthia.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. That was a very good presentation. I learned a lot too. So I'm going to be talking about the government in China, which is also known as the People's Republic of China. So before we get started, and I think there should be another question too if you click. Um, if you guys want to take a couple minutes and just think about these focus questions. So what type of government does China have, and who is the leader of China? So I'll give you guys a few minutes. Hopefully these should be pretty easy. So I'm gonna go ahead and go over it. So the type of government that China has is a totalitarian. So basically this means that the government kind of has all the power in the country. So they control all aspects of life. Even though China is technically a socialist republic, meaning that they do have elected leaders, the government still essentially controls all the power. The people don't really have a lot of power. And we'll look at how the government is structured later to see why this is the case. As for the leader of China, the current leader is Xi Jinping. I'm sorry, Mao Zedong is probably the most well-known leader in China because he was at the founding of the Communist Party and he led for, I think, almost 30 or 40 years. But the current leader is Xi Jinping, and he's been the president of China since 2013. So really quick, the People's Republic of China is led by Xi Jinping. He's the president and he's also the general secretary of the China Communist Party, and that's where he essentially gets most of his power. There's a very strict hierarchy of power in the Chinese government. So unlike in America, where there's kind of checks and balances and things that kind of exist on an equal level to keep each other in check, in China, there's a strict hierarchy. So it's kind of like a pyramid that goes from top to bottom. There's not a lot of not a lot of measures in place that kind of check the power of the government or of the president. And again, China is run by a single party. So it's run by the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. So the same acronym used in Cuba. And this is the only party in the Chinese government. So unlike in America, where we have different parties, for example, Democratic, Republican, or Libertarian, in China, there's only one single party, and all the elected leaders have to come from this party. So going into the Chinese Communist Party, so what is communism? Communism is essentially an ideology that supports a classless society. So basically they want goods and property to be publicly owned, and they believe that people should be paid according to their abilities and needs. So ideally they want to create an equal society. So they want a society where everyone has kind of equal power, equal access to things they need, equal rights. But they usually have to do this by using an authoritarian state, and that's what you see in China. So in order for things to be kind of evenly distributed and for people to have equal power and rights, the government holds all the power and they distribute it that way. So the Chinese Communist Party, like we mentioned earlier, is the only party in China, and it actually is the biggest political party in the entire world with over 89 million members. And it fully dominates all branches of China's political system. So the party as we know it today was founded in 1921 by revolutionaries named Li Dazhou and Chen Duxiu, but it took them a while to get the CCP established, and it took them a bunch of revolutions, a civil war, until it was actually established in 1949. And in 1949, by that time, the party controlled pretty large areas of China, about 100 million people. And they also even had an experienced army, a political program, alliances between peasants and workers. So they were pretty well established. And in 1949, it was led by Mao Zedong, and he led the party and the country until his death in 1976. So he's probably the most well-known Chinese leader because of all the work that he did in China, especially with the Communist Party. The current president of China is Xi Jinping, and he is also the general secretary of the Communist Party. So Xi Jinping is the leader of China, and he's at the top of this kind of hierarchy. So he's currently 67 years old. He became president in 2013, but China recently got rid of their or they don't have the 2-term limit that we have in the United States. So this means that Xi Jinping can basically be president for his entire life, just like Mao Zedong was. So he can be president until he dies, essentially. Whereas in America, you can only be president for 2 terms or 8 years. So his power is very entrenched. And so if you look at this graphic here, you'll see how it's kind of structured like a pyramid. So at the very top, this kind of orange circle represents Xi Jinping, so the leader of China and the general secretary of the Communist Party. And then the second ring around him, those six little cubes, or hexagons, sorry, that's the Politburo Standing Committee. So that is the political bureau or the executive committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And then those six people plus Xi Jinping, those are the seven most important politicians in all of China. So they basically have power over the entire government in the entire country. Um, and then the second or the third layer, the lighter green color, is the wider political bureau. So it's kind of like the outer skirts of the political bureau. And this total top layer has 25 members, including Xi Jinping and the six Politburo members. And this kind of group of people, they're also a lot of the most powerful people in the Chinese government. And all of them are actually members of the Chinese Communist Party. So again, there's not a lot of diversity of thought because they're all part of that one party. And a lot of these people are either very close to Xi Jinping or they hold high roles in the government or the military or other aspects of the party. So all of them, again, are members of the Communist Party. And then the next layer after that layer is the National People's Congress. And this has about 3,000 delegates. And these people are elected from all across China. But again, even though these people don't have to be a part of the Chinese Communist Party, almost all of them are. So essentially this entire like upper government structure is made up of people from the Communist Party. Their main job is to write laws and supervise the government. They're essentially the top governing body of the Chinese government. The main body meets twice a year and they vote on important legislative issues. And members are actually considered to be part-time legislators, so they're not paid for this job. They're elected for a term of about 5 years, and this is kind of considered to be what's called a rubber stamping body. So this means that even though they legally have power, they rarely actually disagree with the upper levels, and basically whatever the upper levels decide, this committee just kind of puts a rubber stamp on it and sends it on its way. So even though they're kind of there to put a limit on the upper levels, they don't actually disagree with them very often. And so essentially there's again a very uniformity of thought, and there isn't a lot of open discussion or checks and balances in this system. So moving away from that kind of main pyramid structure of the Chinese government, a little outer on the outer circle is the State Council, and the State Council is responsible for carrying out the principles and policies of the party, as well as laws and statutes adopted by the NPC. So it's led by Li Keqiang on the right, and on the left is Xi Jinping, the president. And so it's kind of similar to the cabinet in the US government system. It sits beneath the Congress and they administer China's internal affairs, diplomatic affairs, national defense, as well as internal government affairs like cultural or educational issues. And again, these people are also members of the Communist Party, sorry. And then moving on from that, we also have the Chinese military. So it's called the People's Liberation Army, and it's also the biggest army in the world with over 2 million personnel, active personnel. And they report to Congress through the Communist Party. So this means that even though there are separate leaders within the military, they report to the Communist Party. And so the Communist Party basically has direct leadership of the army. This army, it's the largest in the world and it's very high tech, and their goals are dedicated to protecting the sovereignty and security of the People's Republic of China, safeguarding the country's interests, and maintaining and safeguarding world peace. So again, they have their separate leadership, but they also report back to the Communist Party. So everything kind of goes back to those kind of hexagons that we saw earlier, that pyramid and hierarchy of power, and ultimately it all goes back to Xi Jinping. So next we have the judiciary. So China says that it's a country ruled by law, and a lot of areas this is true. We're seeing that commercial law and other types of law have judgments that are increasingly being seen as fair or independent, but a lot of times this rule by law is more like a rule of the party. It's headed by a member of the Politburo, and this member oversees the judiciary and the prosecutors. So again, all of this kind of goes back to the ruling of the Politburo and of the Chinese Communist Party. And then finally, it's important that we talk about censorship in China because this is a really big issue. So China has a very restrictive media environment, one of probably the most restrictive in the entire world. This means that they use censorship to control information that the people can receive, whether it's through the news, online, or in social media. For example, websites like Facebook, Instagram, and a lot of Google services are actually blocked by the government, so you can't access them in China. You have to use a firewall to kind of get around it. And the government also occasionally will use libel lawsuits, arrests, and other means to kind of force Chinese journalists and media organizations to censor themselves. So even though they technically have free speech and freedom of press, there's a ton of restrictions and there's a lot of censorship in China. Overall, there are some benefits to the Chinese government. For example, issues are usually resolved pretty quickly since there's such a uniform ideology in the government, and some people also consider it to be more stable since it's more rigid. There's definitely also drawbacks and issues with freedom, especially with freedom of the press, diversity of thought, just like with other governments. So some discussion questions to think about. What is the structure of the Chinese government? Who and what party leads it? And also, how is the government of China similar or different from the government in the United States? And what about Cuba? To think about this. So the structure of the Chinese government, there's not like one strict word for it, but essentially you want to think of it as in hierarchy instead of like checks and balances. So there's a pyramid and then the power kind of trickles down and it's led by Xi Jinping, who is the president, and everything kind of goes back to him. So even though there's different levels and there's different committees, all aspects of Chinese life are essentially controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and they essentially all go back to Xi Jinping and his kind of tight knit group of members of the Politburo. In terms of comparing it to the government in the United States and Cuba, it's clearly very different from our government in the United States, where, like we mentioned earlier, there's three different branches that can check and balance each other. There's also a multi-party system in the United States, so people can be elected from different parties, and there is more diversity of thought because people can be elected from parties with different ideologies, who have different beliefs. Whereas in China, even though you can elect a leader, they all come from the same party. So you are pretty much electing the same ideologies each time. And because China has no term limit on presidency, the current leader, Xi Jinping, can be president until the end of his life, which could be as long as like 20 or 30 years. So it's a long presidency at once. In terms of Cuba, there are also similarities since Cuba also, the leader is also head of the Communist Party, and most of the members are appointed by the Communist Party. And I think that's it. So thank you, and let me know if you have questions later.
Yeah, Jake mentioned that it sounds like there's lots of similarities to Cuba as well.